For the people who are doing the filming, once we get into the coding section, you're probably going to want to just slap the slides up on all three of these displays. But for now, that's okay. I have a pretty rockin' outfit here. More on that later. I'm dressed for space. Anybody else come dressed for space? Okay, let me ask other questions then. How many designers do we have in this audience? Woohoo! Awesome. And I'm guessing everybody else is developers. Put your little paws up if you're a developer. Oh man, oh, the audience is stacked against me. How many of you took Sarah's workshop yesterday? Nice, okay, hopefully I won't bore you too much. And lastly, who likes the new Star Wars? Nice, okay, I'm fond of it too. More about that later. Hi, I'm Rachel Neighbors, cultivator of the web animation community. I write this little newsletter, founded this little Slack. If you love animation, you should come join us. We're a great group. We have a strong Vue contingent. I'm told that Chris Fritz hangs out on our Vue channel quite a bit. Invited expert at the W3C, Google Developer Expert. You might remember me from such cool things as this DevTools Challenger project with Firefox. I've also helped clients build motion design into their user interfaces and design systems at scale. So I have a little bad news. Today. I was super excited to come talk about how to use animation in Vue to build better user experiences, but my laptop's GPU caught on fire, as it is wont to do. Not the first time this has happened. You work with animation as much as I do, and you go through like 2 or 3 GPUs on some of these models. It's sad. AppleCare people, always with the AppleCare. But I was determined to come here and talk to you all the same, so I had to get a little creative with my demos. I have an iPad and a Chromebook and some sticky tape. Let's do this. I was kind of inspired by The Last Jedi, you know, just saying. So you might notice there's a bit of a theme. It's a retelling of Sleeping Beauty. Oh, you should put them all up on 3 now. It's really pretty. There we go. In space. Ooh. I was torn between calling it Sleeping Duty and Sleeping Beauty, and I was just really bad at these puns. So let's get started. All right, raise your hand if you believe that animation is a necessary part of your complete and balanced user experience. I love you. All right, so those of you who didn't raise your hands, animation is a necessary part of your complete and balanced user experience. Animation conveys information visually that could bog down the rest of the human brain. It allows us to use the human visual system to take cognitive shortcuts. It's pretty awesome. Oh yeah, I should totally be timing myself, and I'm not. Okay, we're good. But animation helps keep users on task and confusion-free because they don't have to stop and think about what just happened. You're literally showing them. They've got a whole section of their brain devoted to digesting what's happening. This lets their much less performant CPU in their brain stay on task and do what you got them there to do. And some things are easier to grok when they're in motion. For instance, here in the before and after shots, it's the same 3 dots, but you can't really tell whether one of them was lifted or the other one was swapped. But if you had animated that, it would be very clear the relationship of those dots to each other. So they do a great job of demonstrating things, showing things by example, often replacing a video or a flood of text. I mean, I wrote a book about it. Yes, I have copies to sign, see me after. There may or may not be a lightning talk from this. So we're all in here. Now, before we launch in to how to use Vue's awesome transitions, I wanted to make sure that we were 100% on board with CSS transitions. There are pretty big concepts in here. Briefly, a CSS transition is like an event watcher on your element, listening for changes to display properties. For instance, if we set a transition to watch the color property of this ball, like transition color 800 milliseconds, and we change it to pink, what the transition does is it goes, the color's changed, computer, interpolate between those 2 values, and that's your animation right there. Your transition is just watching for changes to that CSS property. So this is how you set that kind of a CSS watcher, if you will. You get the transition, set the CSS property you're watching for, The first time value, it can be seconds or milliseconds, is always the duration. The second time value is optional, seconds or milliseconds. CSS always reads any second time value in the transition property as being the delay. True story. And easing, we're just not going to go there today. This isn't a CSS talk. This is a Vue talk. All right, so you can do some neat things with CSS transitions. Here we're taking two images. We've got a glow 1 and a glow 2 up there, and they're both set at an opacity 0, right? And their transition is also set to be watching opacity. Now when we hover over the pod, both of their opacities change to 1. So they go from being completely invisible to being opaque. And this gives us this beautiful glowing effect, nice little hover effect, because it's containing elements been hovered, and anything inside there gets a lovely opacity of 1. Sweet. I could go on and on about all the features of CSS animations and transitions, but the clock is ticking. Ooh, 6 minutes in already. So let's scoot along. I have a course, you can check it out. Don't worry, there are slides, you get coupons. So, Vue uses the heck out of CSS transitions. In fact, Vue's animation element itself is called transition. Hooray, brilliantly named. So you wrap it around the thing you want to transition and give it a name. That's kind of important for later. So here's an example of that syntax without the animation. We got a little if statement, well, show statement up there. I like show over if. Wrap it in transition, nice. We've got some cloaking technology going on here. When we click this, it disappears, so, well, it's lacking some animations. We should get on that. All right, transitions, they let us add entering and leaving animations for any element or component in the following contexts. You got a dynamic component on your hand, your component root node, or you've got conditional rendering using vif, or conditional display using vshow. Pro tip, if you're planning to change an element frequently, bringing it on and off of the screen frequently, do you consider using vshow over vif, because vif requires adding and removing nodes from the DOM. It has a little bit of a cost. I am a big fan of vshow for that reason. So, there's no animation happening in this video at all. Let's just do something with the ship so it looks way more awesome. Let's give the computer some instructions for how to interpolate between opacity 0 and opacity 1. Fortunately, Vue comes with some pretty awesome CSS hooks. And by hooks, I mean classes. This name here, that name property here that I told you was so important, well, every time you've got a transition, Vue generates a bunch of classes to go with it. And they're name spaced. So now you've got uncloaked enter 2, uncloaked enter active, and leave 2, and active, etc., so forth. I'll break it down. So each transition that you have has a life cycle, an entering life cycle for when that element is placed on the page, and an exiting life cycle for when it is removed from the page. And, all right. So, the enter cycle, all right. Oh yeah. The hard part about working with animations and slides, sometimes they don't always do the thing you expect them to. So here we've got ship uncloaked set to true. So when we take the cloaking off of the ship, it's visible, right? It's got two classes, uncloak enter, which actually is placed upon the element exactly 1 frame before the element is added to the DOM. And then, as soon as it is released, as soon as uncloaked is removed, it's one frame. I forget if it's before or after, but immediately after it's removed, uncloak enter 2 is popped on there instead. This is handy because we can have uncloak enter set to opacity 0, it's coming into view, and uncloak enter 2 set to opacity 1. I sometimes I say uncloak enter from in my head just to keep them distinct. Now the fun part is, where do you set your watcher? You set it on uncloak enter active. That's where you set your transition. Nice. You've got your properties that you're transitioning, and you've got this class that stays with the animation for its entire cycle to watch those properties change. We have exactly the same thing happening over here with leave as well. It's mirror images. For the most part, I have found when working with view animations and transitions that I don't use enter to or leave. I just set my default properties on that CSS, on that particular element to opacity 1 in this case. The ship has opacity 1, and I'm only setting opacity 0 in uncloak enter at the beginning of that enter life cycle, and opacity 0 at uncloak leave 2, the end of that exiting life cycle. This is pretty good because it means if for some reason, and we'll get to this later, if for some reason your users are not playing animations, or you've decided we're turning off animations for this situation, you still have this default state that you can fall back on. Think of that default state as how you want this to look if animations were not supported. All right, sweet. So, cloaking technology, activate. We've got our uncloak name set. Oh, look, handy CSS classes. Who put those there? Setting opacity to 0. Transition. We're watching opacity down here in our active states. We set it to 1,000 milliseconds. And when we click on it, toggling that transition, boosh. The exit animation runs, and then after the animation has finished playing, view removes it. Or hides it if you're using if you're using show. So here's an interesting thing. What if you're not adding and removing stuff from the page? You just want something on the page to animate in. I don't know. One popular thing I've noticed these days is people like to fade text in as you're scrolling. This is a horrible user pattern. Don't do that. Nobody, you're already scrolling it into view. Why are you fading it also? It's already animated. Anyway. So, what if, instead of watching for a change, watching for a DOM element to be added or removed, we just want to animate ASAP something that is on the page? Well, for that, we have this handy little thing called appear. And you can just put appear on your transition and wrap it around any element, and that thing is going to have an enter animation slapped on it just as soon as it's rendered. No if, ands, or buts required. So here is an example. This little title screen is just sitting here. It looks pretty cool, right? But what if we made it more awesome? What if we put appear on it? Yeah. Now we're going to have it animate, and oh yeah, now it looks great. I did not even have to check for any properties being true. Well, you may have noticed in that one that the transition I was using wasn't a regular transition. It was a transition group. Transition is great for working with single elements or hiding and showing individual elements, but transition group is specifically awesome for working with groups of elements. If you want to coordinate lots of different things and animate them in different ways at the same time for the same reasons, that's where a transition group comes in. So a transition, a single transition, will wrap an element like so. Very simple. But a transition group can wrap as many as you like, and it will add those cycle classes to each of those elements as they're being animated on or off of the page. Pretty nifty. So here we've got, ooh, this one's exciting. We've got 2 buttons for paging through the story here. Now, when I set this up originally, you can see that there's a little story happening beneath the pod. It's telling the story of Sleeping Beauty in space. And as you click through them, yeah, they're coming on and off the page, but they look pretty gnarly. I don't know, I would not want to release this to somebody. That's pretty sad. So how do we fix that? Well, we're going to remove these sad individual transitions we placed on both buttons, and we're going to replace them with a fancy schmancy transition group. How will that work? Let's take a look. Come down. Oh, it looks a little bit better. At least they're not cutting in and out. They're doing a little fade, but they're still kind of jumping on and off. Well, transition group gives us this really cool class, another cycle class called move. And it is also namespaced. So it's using button, because the transition group's name is button. And here we've set move to watch transforms. And if you look down in the middle there, now it's doing this really, really nice, smooth animation. I would be fine with releasing that. That looks pretty smooth. That looks slick. The move class actually is added only in transition groups and is specifically used with the flip animation technique to move the things that you're transitioning around a bit. It's pretty cool. Flip is a great performance boost. It's the only animation in Vue that uses it, and who knows, maybe one day we'll see more of them. But I like it. It's a nifty trick. It works great with lists. It works great with menus. One pro tip, if you are using multiple items within a transition group with the same tag name, be sure to set a key on each of them. Otherwise, transition group gets a little confused and thinks you're trying to toggle the same P tag. True story. All right. So, managing toggling elements. Got more elements, you're going to have more problems. What about a situation where you might want to toggle between two elements in a transition? You want one thing to show, you want the other thing not to show. That's reasonable, right? So here we've got a transition that shows this face. You click on the pod and you see this face, right? But also the story is kind of covering up a part of the face. I only want the face to show or the story to show. You should be on task when you're interacting with this thing. Either you're inspecting the face or you're working with the story. There's supposed to be a cool little game with the face where you're like shining a light on it. That's super neat, but GPU fire. So just know that there's supposed to be a task there. You could be reading or you can be inspecting, but neither of the twain shall meet. So what are we going to do? First, we are going to wrap both these elements in a transition being named UI. And then we're going to take this class for tail, we're going to add an else statement to it. So either the face is showing or the story is showing. Nice, right? You can do that if you wrap two elements inside one transition. But notice that the face and the user interface, the story, are transitioning at the same time. And I think that looks very cluttered and gross. I don't want her face to be fading in over the story, and I want them to have their individual space. So what am I going to do here? Well, let me tell you about transition modes. Transition modes let us determine who goes first. We've got in, out. A new element animates in first, and then when it's complete, the current element will animate out, and out in is basically like the out in is sort of like the element is being like, oh no, after you. And the new element then is like, oh, why thank you so much for letting me in. So here's how they look. I believe in showing versus telling. So we're changing mode at the top, using mode out in. Now her face comes in, and then the menu comes in. Story goes out, she comes in. Now we're going to change it to in, out, and now she comes in, story goes out. I think I like the first one a little bit better because her chin's not being backed with the storybook, but you know, to each their own. So that was all groovy, but what happens when you bring transitions, transition groups, appear, etc. together? Well, hold on to your warp drives. All right. So here we've got two transition groups. We've got the transition group on the curtains, and we have a transition group on the title. Each curtain, each individual curtain here has its own, yeah, there you go. Thank you, Rachel, past Rachel. Each curtain element inside that group has its own transition class. It's really sweet. And as you can see, we've got a pile of different images in there. I was really going crazy with the bitmaps. Not a good way to make SVG on my iPad at this time. And of course, up there in the title, we've got an entire dynamic component being rendered with a transition group in it. So all this is great for bringing things on and off the page, but what if you want to change the appearance of something that's already on the page? And I don't mean appear, like I mean like you're changing the state of something and it's on the page. It didn't go anywhere. You're not using show or if or swapping it out for anything, but you want it to animate in reaction to something that the user has done. Now, there isn't exactly a Vue transition group for this. It's something that you have to do with classes. In this instance, in this scene, the user interface is already on the page. We've got this blinking screen. What we do is we set the access system property. Oh my gosh. Good job, Rachel. Hang on. Did I demo this? All right. There we go. So in this scene, the user interface is already on the screen, right? And we've got this meteor thing coming in. Oh, we're going to go click on it, and then it goes to being open. And we get these warnings coming up in the console. And if we click it again, which I'll do in a moment, it's going to close. It's going to animate into a closed position. There we go. So this object that's already on the page is going from an open to a closed state. How did we do that? First, we're setting a value in our data object access system. We're setting it to false. It's Boolean, obviously. And what we're going to do is when someone clicks on that panel, it's going to change the state of that value, which also changes the class. Right here, on click, we're going to change the access system's value, and we're binding that value to the class. It will be set to UI open, which has all those awesome transforms and rotations set to it. It's a little roundabout, but it works, and you're allowed. This way, we're using our data as sort of a hack job state management. All right, just to recap. When clicked, we toggle access system true or false. And when access system is true, we're totally giving that UI panel a class of UI open, to which we have all these wonderful new transforms added. Ta-da! All right, I hope you had as much fun as I did with CSS. It's kind of my bag. But now it is time to JavaScript. And we are not going to talk about GreenSock. Y'all should have gone to Sarah Drasner's workshop to learn about GreenSock. No, we're going to talk about the other GreenSock, the Web Animations API. It's a little standard that the W3C has been working on for some time. And I'm not talking about just because I wrote most of the documentation on MDN. It is, okay, there we go. Sometimes audio. It's a standard. It's supported across Chrome and Firefox. Sounds like one day soon, Safari. So it's exciting to play around with, and I enjoy it when I have time on the weekends, which is from time to time. So here's that same beginner animation we started with, only this time we're using the Web Animations API. As you can see, it totally worked. It worked fine. There was no difference. That's probably because the Web Animations API is what CSS animations and transitions are written in under the hood. So first off, we don't need to name that transition. Boosh, don't need that. But we do want to assign a function to its leave event, because each transition does get a set of JavaScript hooks. It's got leave, it's got enter, it's got leave to. It has some really great canceled ones. For the sake of time, I am not going to walk through reading a bullet list of each of these hooks, but you can go to the documentation on Vue, and it's very thoroughly documented, I assure you. We're just going to focus on this one here, leave. We've given it this function, uncloak. Sweet, right? Pro tip, you want to set vbind CSS to false. This results in fewer conflicts and better performance if you're not going to be using the CSS classes as well. This basically says, hey, Vue, don't be touching the DOM with no CSS classes here. We are handling this with JavaScript. You skedoodle. The bad news is that now you have to tell Vue when the animation has ended. That's fun too. I'll show you, don't worry, you're good. So this was the CSS we used before. It was pretty straightforward. We're going to move all of that out of the presentation layer and straight into the behavior layer, into the JavaScript. Here's how we write that as an animation with the glorious Web Animations API. We've created a, first you get an object off of, here we've got the star shape, we go get an element, we call the animate method on it, we pass it an array of key value pairs. Those are our keyframes. In this case, we've got two, an opacity 0 and opacity 1, and then another object which is full of timing values, duration, fill. We're not talking about fill modes, I promised. No fill, no easing, but just know it works. All right, remember how we bound leave to uncloak? Let's take a closer look on that one. First, we are going to keep track of that function over here in our methods. Nice. Sweet. So the important thing to remember in all of this is, first off, it's done. But we're calling the cloaking animation right down here with play. But for this particular kind of animation, remember I told you we would have to tell JavaScript when the animation was done? Fortunately, the Web Animations API does have a callback for when it's finished called onFinish, and we're just assigning done to that. That literally fires as soon as the animation is over to say, hey view, my animation is done. You can remove this DOM element from the DOM tree now, or you can finish adding it, etc. You need to call done if you're not using CSS classes and hooks. You need to call it on both enter and leave animations. Sweet. So done is only optional if you're using CSS. One other hook requires done, it's enter. There are quite a lot of JavaScript hooks. Go check them out on the docs. So we can do some pretty advanced stuff. Here we're using a transition group. It's using appear as well. But what's happening over in the JavaScript on the right side here is we're using the Web Animations API to randomly set a delay on each one of the elements. So every time this page loads, different things are going to load at different times. That's pretty cool. You couldn't do that with CSS animations alone. Anyway, if you want to learn more about the Web Animations API, I got resources for you. Visit my site /WAAPI to get all those links. But you probably want to use GreenSock for the near future, so you should have taken Sarah Drasner's workshop. All right, here's the fun part. This is something I am super jazzed about. Do we have any accessibility champions in the audience? Woo, you guys are heroes. Oh my God, I hope some of you are going to come up here and give talks about accessibility in Vue.js. That would be super special. I'd love that. You know, maybe next year, submit something. Now, while there are many cognitive benefits to designing with animation, for a select minority of the population, animations downright suck. UI animation can cause negative side effects for some people. For instance, we all know about seizures, flashing, bright red, changes of colors across large screens, etc., can cause some people to have seizures. This can be especially dangerous if they're looking at their cell phone as they're crossing the street. You don't want to fall over having a seizure in that situation. That one's pretty well known. Also, people who suffer from something called vestibular disorders can experience nausea triggered by that thing we call parallax motion. You know, when you scroll jack the site so that different parts of it are moving and animating at different rates than other parts. A lot of people aren't big fans of that. And then, of course, there's distraction and fatigue. Even people who have dyslexia or some people on the autism spectrum can be horribly distracted by things like loading spinners. It can cause them to feel like really not cool with whatever it is that you've built. That's not a good way for retaining customers. You want to accommodate them. I mean, for these reasons, the good people at Apple back in iOS 7 introduced a reduced motion option in their interface after getting so many complaints from users that the zooming animation on the apps was causing them to feel motion sickness. There's some pretty cool people over at Apple. They have some folks who work on WebKit, i.e. Safari. And the folks at WebKit, they made a media query, specifically a reduced motion media query, that would respect if users had set that preference. I should also mention that Windows has similar reduced animation preferences as well. So operating systems already have set a precedence for turning animations on and off. And there's already some ideas in the web community about how we could natively support that. Let's take a look at how this could look. Now, in this example, we're going to use it by taking all of our animations that we were setting we take all of our animations and we're going to really brute force this. I'm going to go back to the beginning. If the person prefers reduced motion, that is to say, prefers reduced motion, reduce is true, we are going to go out, get all the animation durations and all the transition durations on all the things, set them to 0, and bang important them. What this essentially says is it makes all the animations and transitions run instantaneously, and any event listeners waiting for them to end will still fire, so nothing is broken. Don't use timers, people. Please use event listeners. Listen for those animations to end. Use those hooks. Because someday things like this might be a pattern that show up everywhere. So let's compare and contrast. Animated, okay, looks pretty cool. Now I've decided I don't like that. I'm going over to reduce motion. I've swiped it. And now, here it is, not animated. It still works. Okay, WebKit, you're glitchy. WebKit. It's going to blow out the GPU on my iPad next. So anyway, it still works. It set everything to have no duration at all, and it's still usable. It still opens, it still closes. It's just doing it with less distraction and less fanciness. So the unfortunate thing is the media queries are only supported on Safari so far. So what are we going to do for everybody else? We don't want people like throwing up when they're using our app, but at the same time, we know that we get such great benefits from using animation that why would we not? How do we give colossal benefits to the bulk of our users while still respecting the wills and needs of some of our users who are also important to us? Well, it's called choice, and it's pretty awesome. We can give users the option to choose how they want to experience the things that we have created. Now, in this case, I'm like, why don't we just put a bar across the top of the page and be like, hey, there's some animations. You want to turn those on or off? I mean, the UK has had to do this for years with cookies, and it hasn't ruined design there. It's certainly not going to start ruining the design for the rest of the world. It'll only improve the experience for some people. So I made a version to work with Vue, work with this particular UI at least. All right, so we've got the little bar at top, and we can set it off or on, and it will toggle between those two kinds of showing change. How did I do that? Well, the magic is in these 4 properties inside that data object. I also commented this really a lot. I don't know if I'm going to say well, but it was a lot. So there's a lot of comments. Go to the pen, rip it up, see what I've done there. The most important one is animations on. It's set to true or false. I like to set it to true by default, but if you are AAA, you want to set it to false by default. That's okay. I commented that section too. Animations on, you set the toggle. It ultimately determines whether or not the animations should be playing on that page. I've also stored the motion query here in case it changes. I only have to update it in one place. And we've got our accessible animations supported accessible animation query supported value, which will be true or false depending on all these little sniffings of, hey, is reduced motion supported here? Is it? And finally, if it is supported, we get prefers animation set to true or false based on that support and the user's preference. It's a lot of work to accommodate mobile Safari, but I did it. All right, so here the actual function to check is, it's long, and it's kind of like, I'm open to code review here. But it listens for system preference changes as well. So if I go over and change this to change my preference midway, it totally respects it. It's lovely. I love the sort of APIs built around motion queries. They're doing great. So the magic is actually happening well, maybe I didn't set it to play, or maybe it was a long pause. Anyway, the magic happens in the wrapping elements tag up here. In the div ID cockpit at the very top, you'll see that it's got an animated, I see what I was doing. Great job, past Rachel. At the very top, you can see that the class animated will be set if animations on is true. So that basic function determines whether or not everything inside that element is scoped with animated. And what am I going to do? I'm going to scope all my animations to that class. Look at all those beautiful animations that are all scoped to that animated class. Huzzah. So what about JavaScript, Rachel? Well, it can be made to work with JavaScript as well. In your JavaScript animation hooks handler, just check to see if animations on is true, and then run the animation. And of course, if this is enter or leave, don't forget to call done. Here it is at work in that pen collection I told you about earlier. Woohoo! Well done. Man. So this story is to be continued. I had to cut some things because GPU fires, but I might be up for giving a little lightning talk about when and where to use animations in your design a little bit later. Hopefully you'll be around for that. In the meantime, I would like to say thanks to wonderful people who have assisted me. Chris Fritz, awesome person, totally walked me through a lot of things as I was getting started with Vue, a great member of the community. Sarah Drasner for suggesting I pitch this idea and come talk with you all. And I would like to thank all of you for coming and being here today, and also being so pumped about animation. Thank you. Here are all the slides, the docs, the pens. They're all on CodePen. And if the Vue Vixens want to know where I got this awesome Kylo Ren dress, and it is an awesome Kylo Ren dress, that's from heruniverse.com. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.